You're such a disappointment. His words rang in my ears, louder than the cheers he'd received that night for his promotion. I stood frozen in the kitchen, the plate I'd been drying slipping from my hands and shattering on the floor. Disappointment? After everything I'd given up for him? The sacrifices I made to support his climb to the top? The memory of that day came rushing back. James sat across from me at our favorite cafe and asked me to quit my job. His hand was warm over mine as he painted a rosy picture of lazy mornings, laughter-filled dinners, and a life free of stress. I hesitated, thinking of my graphic design job. More than just a paycheck, it was a part of who I was. But James reassured me that my career could wait. He made it sound like an investment in our future, one that would make us stronger. Out of love and trust, I handed in my resignation and stepped into a role I thought would bring us closer. Instead, I'd walked straight into a nightmare. The life he'd promised was nothing like reality. My days were a blur of cleaning, cooking, and waiting. Always waiting. James's gratitude had faded, replaced with indifference. And now, with those cruel words echoing in my head, I wondered if I had traded my dreams for a man who no longer cared to see me. At first, I tried to embrace the role James had envisioned for me. I threw myself into the work of being the perfect wife, even if the idea chafed against everything I once thought I'd be. I hosted elaborate dinner parties for James's colleagues, spending hours preparing intricate meals and setting tables with pristine arrangements. James wanted to impress his coworkers, and I became the invisible hand behind his success. They'd compliment the food and decor, and James would beam, taking credit with a glib, "Sophie outdid herself again." Not once did he suggest I join the conversation or recognize my efforts beyond a brief nod in my direction. Then there was the house. I redecorated every room to match James's vision of success. Sleek, modern, and magazine-worthy. I spent weeks agonizing over color schemes, furniture placement, and finding the perfect accent pieces. It felt like a job in itself, but unlike my graphic design work, this came with no acknowledgement. When the living room was finally complete, James glanced around and said, "Looks good. Next time, let's try not to overspend." Maintaining my appearance became another unspoken demand. James liked his wife polished, so I made sure to stay that way. I experimented with skincare routines, kept up with my fitness classes, and made regular trips to the salon. It was exhausting and expensive. Yet, the effort seemed invisible to him. If I skipped a gym session or dared to wear my hair in a ponytail, I'd catch his pointed glances. "You're spending a lot on these serums," he said one night as he flipped through our bank statement. "Are they even working?" I'd laughed it off, but his words lingered, adding another layer of self-doubt. On the rare occasion I dressed down, his comments cut deeper. "You've been slacking lately," he'd say with a smirk, as though it were a joke. My efforts, once motivated by love and hope, started to feel futile. He began dismissing my home-cooked meals in favor of takeout, complaining that I'd tried too hard or that the food was just okay. The compliments dwindled until they disappeared altogether. Every act of care I put into our lives seemed to vanish into thin air, unnoticed and unappreciated. Slowly, I felt myself shrinking. The woman who had been vibrant, ambitious, and creative was fading away, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I had built my world around James, and yet, in his eyes, I was becoming invisible. The emptiness crept in, subtle but insistent, until it was all I could feel. The evening started like any other of James's work parties. The house was immaculate, the food meticulously prepared, and I dressed in a sleek cocktail dress James had picked out months earlier. I floated between the kitchen and the living room, refilling glasses and making sure every guest felt at ease. Then I heard him. "She's just a housewife," James said, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation. I paused in the doorway, stunned. He was talking to one of his colleagues, a younger man who hung on his every word. "I mean, it's fine. Someone's got to keep things running at home. She's not exactly ambitious, though." My face burned. humiliation mixing with a slow-building anger. After everything I'd sacrificed for him, this was how he spoke about me? I slipped away before I could hear more, the bile rising in my throat as I replayed his words in my head. When the last guest left, I confronted him. "I heard what you said tonight," I began, my voice trembling. He looked up from his phone, unbothered. "What are you talking about?" "You called me unambitious. You said I was just a housewife." James sighed, setting his phone down with exaggerated patience. "You're being too sensitive, Sophie. It was just a casual comment." "Casual?" I repeated, incredulous. "That's how you see me?" "I didn't mean anything by it," he insisted, his tone dismissive. "You're imagining things. Stop overreacting." His words hit like a slap. Gaslighting, I realized later, though at the time, I only felt a deep, suffocating sense of self-doubt. Lying awake that night, I thought about how much I had given up for James. I'd always been ambitious and independent before meeting him. I remembered the job offer I'd turned down at a leading design firm, my dream opportunity, because James had convinced me we'd be better off if I focused on us. He'd promised it was temporary. "Once I'm established," he'd said, "you can go back to work." But that moment never came. The cracks in our relationship widened with each passing week. James's remarks grew sharper, laced with disdain. "What exactly do you do all day?" he asked one evening, walking into a spotless house with dinner simmering on the stove. I stared at him, speechless. Another time, he saw me sitting on the couch after hours of cleaning. "Must be nice to relax all day," he quipped, grabbing a beer from the fridge. I'd barely slept the night before, exhausted from scrubbing the kitchen floor until it gleamed. When I suggested taking on freelance design projects, his reaction was swift and cutting. "Why bother? It's not like we need the money," he said, waving off the idea. But the very next week, he complained about our finances, insinuating I wasn't contributing enough. The man who had once promised to take care of me now seemed to resent my very existence. Each comment chipped away at the foundation of our relationship, and at me. James's promotion was announced with the fanfare of a royal coronation. He insisted we throw a lavish party to celebrate, one where his colleagues and superiors could bask in his success. I spent days preparing for the event, cleaning the house from top to bottom, planning a gourmet menu, and ensuring every detail was flawless. It was exhausting, but I told myself it would all be worth it when James saw how much I supported him. As the party unfolded, I watched James mingle effortlessly, his confidence magnetic. When it came time for his speech, I stood near the back of the room, expecting some acknowledgement for my efforts. Instead, he thanked his colleagues, his mentors, even his parents for their unwavering support. Not a single word about me. My face burned with humiliation, but I kept smiling, determined not to ruin the evening. Then, as I passed by the kitchen, I heard James's voice again. James's tone was light and dismissive as he remarked to a colleague that I was lucky to stay home all day without worrying about money, adding that I had it easy. It felt like a punch to the gut. I slipped upstairs, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses fading behind me. Alone in our bedroom, I let the tears come, hot and bitter. I'd given up everything for him, and this was how he saw me, as someone who contributed nothing, someone whose sacrifices meant nothing. The next morning, I confronted him. "Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" I demanded. "I've given up everything for you, James. Everything. And you act like I'm just nothing." He looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. "You're overreacting again," he said. "Nobody's keeping score here. You chose this life, Sophie. Don't act like you were forced into it." I had chosen that life because I believed in James and in the life we were building together. But he didn't respect me. He didn't even see me. The realization boiled over into words I couldn't hold back, fueled by anger and years of suppressed hurt. James shrugged, his indifference cutting deeper than any words. Maybe you're not happy because you've got too much time on your hands. Find a hobby or something. I can't be responsible for your feelings. It was in that moment I realized how little he cared. Everything I'd done, everything I'd given up, meant nothing to him. And for the first time, I began to wonder if it was time to walk away. It started with the late nights. James's work had always been demanding, but lately, he'd been coming home later and later, often with vague excuses about urgent meetings or last-minute deadlines. At first, I brushed it off as part of his new promotion, but something felt off. He no longer offered details about his day, and the casual warmth he once shared was replaced by a cold distance I couldn't ignore. The first real clue came in the form of a credit card statement. I'd always managed our finances, keeping track of bills and purchases. This time, I noticed a string of charges I couldn't account for. Expensive dinners at restaurants we'd never been to, boutique purchases I hadn't made, and even a stay at a luxury hotel in the city. When I asked James about it, he waved me off with a chuckle, calling it client entertainment, and accusing me of overanalyzing. But the seed of doubt was already planted. My days were suddenly consumed with unease. Late one evening, when James left his laptop unattended, I hesitated only for a moment before opening it. My hands trembled as I sifted through his emails. Most were work-related, but then I saw her name. Melissa. She was young, fresh out of college, and worked as his assistant. The emails started innocently enough, discussions about scheduling and reports. But as I scrolled further, my stomach churned. They became personal, flirtatious, filled with inside jokes and plans for secret rendezvous. My chest tightened as I read messages, arranging dinner dates and weekends away, ones he had carefully concealed under the guise of business trips. My suspicions were fully confirmed when I found the receipts. Tucked into a folder on his desktop were invoices for extravagant gifts, designer handbags, jewelry, and a pair of airline tickets to a tropical destination. He'd spent thousands on Melissa while berating me for overspending on groceries and household necessities. The betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. For years, I had sacrificed my dreams, my identity, and my financial independence to support James. And now, not only had he dismissed my contributions, but he had also funneled our resources into an affair that mocked everything we'd built together. The weight of it crushed me, leaving me sobbing on the cold, sterile floor of our bedroom. But the pain quickly turned to resolve. If James thought he could break me, he was wrong. Over the next few days, I quietly gathered evidence. I photographed the credit card statements and emails, saved screenshots of their exchanges, and even recorded snippets of conversations I overheard when he was on the phone with her. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage, but it also steeled my determination. If James wanted to betray me, I'd make sure he wouldn't walk away unscathed. I reached out to a divorce attorney, laying everything bare. She listened with a calm professionalism, guiding me through the steps I'd need to take to protect myself. Her advice was clear. Stay quiet, act normal, and let James dig his own grave. Pretending everything was fine was the hardest part. Each time he smiled at me or kissed my cheek, I felt a surge of anger and disgust. But I played the role of the dutiful wife, knowing that the endgame was worth the charade. I continued to cook his dinners, wash his clothes, and listen to his half-hearted excuses about late nights and weekend plans. But behind my facade, I was planning my escape. By the time I was ready to confront him, I had everything I needed: the receipts, the emails, and a heart hardened by betrayal. James had underestimated me, and soon he'd learn the cost of his arrogance. With all the evidence in hand, I knew it was time to make my move. The old Sophie, the one who had shrunk under James's criticisms and manipulations, was gone. I was no longer the quiet, dutiful wife who would take his dismissiveness in silence. Now I had a plan, and every step I took felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. First, I finalized the details with my lawyer. She had advised me to secure the financial documents and records to prove the extent of James's deceit. armed with copies of his extravagant purchases and a detailed list of his assets, I ensured that I wouldn't be left empty-handed in the divorce. My lawyer's calm assurance gave me strength. She reminded me that justice wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control over my life. But justice, I realized, could also be deeply satisfying. The confrontation was carefully orchestrated. I waited until James had just returned from a work trip, looking smug and self-assured as he set his suitcase by the door. Dinner was already prepared and waiting on the table, a meal he wouldn't soon forget. I had set the scene perfectly. Candles flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room. It looked like the kind of evening he always pretended we had, perfect and harmonious. When we sat down, I let him talk first. He launched into his usual monologue about how exhausting the trip had been, the high-stakes meetings, and how much pressure he was under. I listened, nodding occasionally, letting him dig his own grave. He didn't notice the edge in my smile or the way my hands remained unnervingly steady as I sipped my wine. When he finally paused, I set my glass down and looked him directly in the eyes. "So, how was Melissa?" I asked, my voice calm and measured. James froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. The color drained from his face as he stammered, "What are you talking about?" I slid the folder of evidence across the table, watching his eyes dart to it. The receipts, the emails, the pictures, everything was there, laid bare for him to see. He didn't even attempt to deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair and muttering, "This isn't what it looks like." "It looks like you've been lying to me for months," I said, my voice steady despite the rage bubbling just beneath the surface. "It looks like you've been spending our money on her while calling me financially irresponsible, and it looks like you thought you'd never get caught." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand. "Don't bother. I've already spoken to a lawyer. The papers are ready, and you'll be hearing from her tomorrow." The power shift was palpable. For the first time, James looked small, his carefully crafted facade crumbling before my eyes. He mumbled something about working through this, but I had already stood up, gathering my things. "You don't get to decide that," I said firmly. "This is over." Walking out of that house for the last time felt like shedding a weight I'd carried for far too long. I moved into a cozy apartment in the city, one I decorated entirely for myself. The walls were filled with art I'd created during my nights of quiet reflection, and the space felt alive with color and light. It was mine, and for the first time in years, so was my life. I threw myself into my work, finally taking on the freelance projects I'd dreamed about for years. The clients came pouring in, impressed by my passion and talent. With each completed project, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and pride. My world no longer revolved around James or his ambitions. It revolved around me. James, on the other hand, didn't fare as well. Word of his affair spread quickly among his colleagues, tarnishing his reputation and putting his position at risk. Melissa, it seemed, had no interest in sticking around once the lavish gifts stopped. He tried reaching out to me, leaving voicemails filled with empty apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I didn't answer. He didn't deserve my words. Justice had been served, and I was finally free. As I stood in my studio one evening, a finished painting drying on the easel, I realized something profound. The betrayal that had nearly broken me had also set me free. I had reclaimed my power, my identity, and my happiness, and for that I would always be grateful, not to James, but to myself. The weeks following the confrontation were a whirlwind of emotions, but for the first time in years, the future felt open and full of possibility. My lawyer finalized the divorce swiftly, ensuring I left with my fair share of our assets. James had fought initially, trying to negotiate his way into a better deal, but the evidence I'd gathered left him with little leverage. By the time the paperwork was signed, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. A chapter of my life had closed, and I was free to start anew. I poured my energy into building a life for myself. The cozy apartment I had moved into became my sanctuary. Every piece of furniture, every photo on the wall, reflected my tastes, my choices. It was the first space that truly felt like mine. I filled it with plants, vibrant artwork, and the scent of lavender candles. Even the smallest details, like the soft throw blanket draped over my couch, brought me a quiet joy I hadn't felt in years. Work became my anchor. The freelance projects I'd tentatively begun during my marriage blossomed into a thriving business. Word of mouth spread quickly, and soon I was juggling more clients than I'd ever imagined. Each completed project was a reminder of what I was capable of, proof that I hadn't lost the skills or creativity that had once defined me. I even reconnected with old colleagues who were thrilled to see me thriving again. But it wasn't just about work. I started exploring hobbies I'd long abandoned. I signed up for pottery classes, spent hours wandering art galleries, and even took a solo trip to the coast. The salty air and crashing waves felt like a baptism, washing away the remnants of my old life. For the first time, I felt whole on my own. James had fallen from grace. His affair with Melissa had become public knowledge, and his reputation at work took a hit he couldn't recover from. She left him shortly after the fallout, unwilling to deal with the consequences of their actions. Mutual acquaintances informed me that he was struggling to keep up appearances, his once charismatic facade cracking under the pressure. I didn't feel pity for him, only a strange sense of detachment, as though the man who had hurt me so deeply was now a stranger. One evening, as I sat in my studio sketching the outline of a new painting, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from James. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. "I'm sorry for everything," it read. "I realize now how much I took you for granted. I hope you're doing well." I stared at the words for a long time before deleting the message. His apology came too late and meant too little. My life no longer revolved around his opinions or his approval. I'd moved on, and there was no space for him in the world I was building. That night, as I stepped back to admire the painting I'd been working on, I realized how far I'd come. The vibrant colors on the canvas mirrored the vibrancy I'd rediscovered within myself. I was no longer defined by the sacrifices I'd made for someone else. I was defined by my resilience, my creativity, and my ability to carve out a life that was entirely my own. For years, I had believed that my worth was tied to someone else's success. Now, I knew better. As I stood in the middle of my new design studio, sunlight streaming through the large windows, I felt a deep sense of pride. The walls were lined with samples of my work, vivid and bold, each piece a testament to the journey I'd taken to reclaim myself. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized how far I'd come. The woman who had once doubted her worth, who had sacrificed her dreams and independence for someone else's success, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, more self-assured. The betrayal that had shattered my world also forced me to rebuild it, brick by brick, on my terms. I had learned that sacrifices in a relationship should never be one-sided. Love wasn't about losing yourself to elevate someone else. It was about partnership, mutual respect, and shared growth. James had taught me a painful lesson, but it was one I would carry with me, not as a scar, but as a badge of resilience. I'd also learned to trust my instincts. The nagging doubts I'd ignored for so long had been trying to protect me. Now, I promised myself I'd never silence that inner voice again. Surrounded by my newfound support system of friends, colleagues, and clients who believed in me, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. My life was no longer defined by someone else's vision. It was mine, full of color, creativity, and endless possibilities.